All right, it is 4 o'clock and we're going to get started. I want to welcome you to Link Engineering's video conversation series. My name is Shelley Latham and I'm the community manager for linkengineering.org, which is a project of the National Academy of Engineering with sponsorship from Chevron. Link Engineering is an educator exchange where you can find resources for PK through 12 engineering education. And if you aren't already a member, I encourage you to check it out. While I introduce our guests, I'm going to put up a poll, and which is about what are the biggest challenges that you see to teaching engineering. And I've provided a very handy none of the above and all of the above if none of those feel right or you can't narrow it down. So I'm going to introduce our guests. Christine Cunningham is an educational researcher who works to make engineering and science more relevant, accessible, and understandable, especially for underserved and underrepresented populations. A vice president at the Museum of Science Boston since 2003, she is the founding director of Engineering is Elementary, a groundbreaking project that integrates engineering concepts into preschool, elementary, and middle school curriculum and teacher professional development. Christine is a fellow of the American Society for Engineering Education and received the ASEE K-12 and Pre-College Division Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015. She was awarded the 2014 International Society for Design and Development and Education Prize, the 2015 IEEE Pre-University Educator Award, and in 2017, her work was recognized with the prestigious Harold W. McGraw Jr. Prize in Education. Cunningham holds, Christine, we'll just be on first names terms. Christine holds a BA and an MA degrees in biology from Yale and a PhD in science education from Cornell University. This is very exciting news, everybody. She is the author of a 2018 book, Engineering in Elementary STEM Education, Curriculum Design, Instruction, Learning, and Assessment, published by Teachers College Press and the Museum of Science, Boston. She's joined today by a frequent collaborator, Nancy Yocom de Romero. Nancy has been an elementary school teacher in Framingham, Massachusetts for 18 years. She was a classroom teacher in a two-way bilingual program for 15 years and currently teaches in the SAGE program, in which she works with students and teachers to promote abstract, higher order thinking and creative problem solving in Barbieri and Brophy schools, both of which are bilingual English-Spanish schools. Prior to that, Nancy taught in El Salvador, Central America. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share results. I don't know if everybody can see it or just the panelists can see it, but it looks like 25% don't have extra time, 25% many materials, 25% managing students varied and creative designs, 13% student disappointment with their designs don't work, and 13% grading students on engineering. And nobody is worried about all of the above, which I think is excellent. That's great. Okay, so I am going to turn this over to Christine. And let me just bear with me while I get my bearings. Okay. So are you ready, Christine?
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And since there are two of us presenting, Nancy and myself, if you have questions or comments, we invite you to use that chat feature, and we will try to have one of us talking and the other one monitoring that so we can get some answers or comments back to you in real time. But I thought I'd start today with a little history of my work in this field I started my career looking at engineering education in middle and high school. And I also did a short stint researching at the college level why women tend to stay or leave engineering majors. But my heart really was in K-12, so I returned to that and again about 4 years in middle school and high school. But then I moved down into the elementary school level. Next slide. So my work for the last 15 years has focused there with engineering as elementary. We've now created 5 curricula for children from preschool through middle school for both in-school and out-of-school settings, and have reached over 17 million children. I've known Nancy for almost as long as we've been doing this work. When we decided that we should start thinking about what engineering would look like at the elementary school level, I knew we needed to bring in the experts, the classroom teachers, to help us. So I called around in Massachusetts to a few elementary schools and asked the principals to recommend a teacher or two. My only requirement for the call was that the teacher was not afraid to teach science. So Nancy was one of those that was picked to join us, and she still continues to work and advise us today, 15 years later. So she is definitely one of the first and probably most veteran teachers. Some of you may be familiar with engineering at the K-12 level, but there may be some of you who are also new to engineering and wonder what it might look like with young kids. So did we when we began, frankly, we didn't really know. So to give you a glimpse of what we think engineering looks like, I want to share with you a short video. In this class, students have been studying about insects and pollinators. They're going to apply the science knowledge they've learned as they design a hand pollinator, a device that will pick up and drop off pollen for a model flower.
We're going to make a hand pollinator. The hand pollinator needs to go to a flower, and when it touches the pollen, pollen needs to stick to it. And then when you go to another flower, the pollen would what?
Stick to that one.
Drop off and stick there, and take more and bring it to another flower. I want you to brainstorm ideas for your design.
I have an idea. We could use this one and then just bend it. Yeah. Okay. So let's say number 3, but we'll just bend number 3. How about that? So it'll be half of my. It will look like your idea, but it will do the things that are in my idea. Mm-hmm. So it's both of ours mixed up. Yeah, but how are we gonna put the pom-pom on? Pom-pom? Put it on top. Look what we've created so far. We've used the foil and we've used the pipe cleaner. Yeah, so we're cutting the fur off and putting the fur on the handle.
All right, let's see if this hand pollinator works. Would you say your hand pollinator worked this time?
No.
What do you need to do?
Improve.
Good job. Here we go, testing. 1, 2, 3. Good job. 3-tap test. Okay, lift up your flower. Whoa, did it work?
Yes!
Well, congratulations. Give them a hand.
So this kind of engineering can often be a new discipline for many teachers, and introducing a new subject into schools can be a Herculean task. My team and I have worked with thousands of teachers, supporting them as they transition from novice to expert. So today we're going to explore some of the top concerns that these teachers have expressed as they began to teach engineering. And we'll look at 6 areas. For each, I'll start with a general description, and then Nancy will offer an on-the-ground, or should I say in the classroom, perspective. So challenge number 1 we hear is most commonly, I don't have any extra time. Frequently, teachers lament that they don't have time to teach engineering in an already packed school day. Unfortunately, we can't create more hours in the school day, so we need to thoughtfully consider the ways in which engineering design challenges can support existing instructional goals. We found there great opportunities for engineering to reinforce the science and the math concepts that elementary students learn throughout the year. For example, students who are challenged to design insulation for a solar oven need to grapple with what insulator and conductor mean as they figure out how to function, as we see in this next video.
If we're trying to make the little pot, you can't have an insulator because that means all the heat's going to go out, and then whatever you're trying to make. The insulator makes it in conductor. Remember the word conductor. Insulator. Look, but insulator, it has the word in at the beginning. That's how you remember. Insulate.
So clearly needing to use that concept is helping those kids to refine their understanding of the science concept as they think about applying it to the engineering challenge. Research, including some of that we've done, has shown that when engineering activities are specifically designed to introduce science concepts, students learn the science better. Students understand concepts more deeply when they are able to apply the abstract knowledge to specific hands-on tasks. Engineering lends itself well to project-based learning. It provides an overarching problem that students can solve by drawing on knowledge gained from many different disciplines. So as you teach engineering, you can reinforce topics like science and math, but also literacy and social studies. For example, when third grade students are asked to evaluate the landscape in the village in Nepal, to choose an appropriate site for a type of bridge called a tarpole, they have to balance different constraints based on scientific evidence. For example, how quickly different substrates erode. But they also have to take into account societal and cultural considerations based on where the villagers might want the bridge to be. So in this engineering challenge, the students have a map. Next slide. With the different potential sites for the tarpole bridge marked by letters of the alphabet, as you'll see. Listen to their arguments in this video. Notice how they use their science knowledge, for example, erosion occurs faster where a river curves, and also how they use their knowledge of cultural constraints as they were presented in the storybook at the start of the unit. The boy in the book has a grandmother he calls Aji, who is sick and can't walk very far to get to the clinic.
It sounds like you've narrowed it down to E and F. True? Okay, I'm going to come back and check on you. You've got to narrow it down because a lot of people are already down here talking about the advantages and disadvantages, which you've already talked about. But we got to get it down on paper like an engineer would.
All right, I think we should do F. 3 on 1. Let's 3 on 1. Why? Because it's closer to the clinic. But it's closer to a curve. F, you have to walk 2. It's closer to a curve. So? Yeah. That's what are legs for? Yeah. No, the Aji cannot walk because she's sick. Yeah, so somebody will carry her. But or help her. Well, after all. She's well now. She's well. Come on, he's closer and straight. Oh and my God. 3 on 1. 3 on 1. That's it. We're doing rock, paper, scissors. All right, fine. Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. Oh, we're doing F. Booyah.
Oh, Christine, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I had my thing on mute because I was coughing.
Right.
Obviously, this is not the ideal way for students to reach a decision, but it's probably a technique that real engineers revert to occasionally as well. In a culminating activity in this lesson, students write a letter to the village elders to recommend a location and communicate how they reached their conclusion, thus drawing on language arts skills such as persuasive writing. So if you're thinking about how to carve out a space to teach engineering during your school year, you might start by looking at the scope and sequence maps for the science topics you teach. Then choose or create engineering instructional units that align with that content. As you do so, consider how engineering themed lessons can reinforce the skills and ideas your students will learn in math, English language arts, or social studies. In this way, you're not only making time for a completely new subject, but helping your students understand other subject matters more deeply and effectively. Of course, integration and connections can help alleviate time pressures, but it's true that engineering challenges will also require some dedicated classroom time, as there are new concepts to discuss and design challenges to do. Some teachers with highly prescribed curriculum choose to offer engineering during times of year when the constraints are more relaxed. For example, they'll do it after state testing occurs, or during time periods when student energy levels are really high and best harnessed by active units, such as the week before school vacation. But regardless of whether and how teachers integrate engineering, most find that the skills that their students develop are well worth the time investment. I've noticed that once teachers see the impact of engineering on their students and how engaged they can be, they are masters at figuring out where they can wedge it in. So Nancy's going to talk more about being a master.
Well, so when I was a classroom teacher, I definitely found that routine was a wonderful thing, and having the kids have a sense of structure was great. But I often found that at different points, also messing with that and shaking things up a little bit definitely would spark their excitement about things as well. So since I had my children for most of the school day, I often found that that things would work really well if I could plug in, say, the storybook part in during my read aloud time, so that kids could get some background. They may be having some of those preliminary science lessons that would then go along with the engineering concepts as I would read the storybook. And then a few days later, I would often delegate large chunks of time to working on the lessons that really went into then developing the ideas, making sure that they understood exactly what they needed to do, and being able to do a little bit of experimenting to figure that out. In the engineering as elementary lessons, those were lessons 3 and 4. So by doing a couple of large chunks of time over a few days, to me, works better than spreading a whole bunch of shorter lessons over multiple weeks. This way, I find that my students are able to create, test, and improve a design all within the same lesson or period of time that they're in the classroom. Or maybe when they first are starting looking at the design, they're really looking at what components, what constraints they'll have to do, so that they can not just look at that, but then go ahead and do their brainstorm and talk a bit with their peers to plan some things out. By doing that, I think I look at it like a sports sort of game. My son was supposed to have soccer tryouts today, and it's kind of like being able to go through the whole play in that sports game rather than calling a timeout. There's more fluidity of ideas, and it kind of gets you to the goal.
That was great. Apologies for my inept screen share activity.
Okay, so another challenge that teachers also talk to us about is the idea that there are just so many materials to prepare. We believe that one of the core concepts of engineering that everyone, but particularly kids in K-12, should learn is the importance of materials and their properties for engineering. The materials that are used in engineering solutions in both the real world and the classroom all have their own sets of properties. They might be fuzzy or transparent, strong, lightweight, inexpensive, malleable, so forth. These properties will dictate how the materials behave, and they should drive on the student's part which ones are selected for their technology. All engineers need to consider materials, including their behavior under certain conditions, their interaction with one another, their environment, their cost, and their aesthetics as they design technology. As we human beings engage with our world, we build this knowledge of materials. Adults have a much more developed sense of materials and how they can be used than young children or your students do. So for example, if you ask an adult which material will pick up pollen best, marbles, erasers, pom-poms, tinfoil, or pipe cleaners, almost all of them will recognize that fuzzy materials like pom-poms and pipe cleaners are the best choices. Adults not only understand how these individual materials might behave, but also are much more able to generalize about their properties. For example, fuzzy things are usually pretty good at picking up small particles. Thus, adults are able to extrapolate and make conjectures about how unfamiliar materials might behave based on their properties. But these kinds of general characteristics are not as obvious to young children, as you probably know. Infants are not born with such knowledge. Children tend to develop it over time through interaction with and manipulation of the world around them. So we believe that students need rich opportunities to explore materials. They need to touch, try, talk about these materials and their properties. As they start to think about the problem they're going to solve, they should gather information and think about the dimensions of that problem. So this problem definition can draw students' attention to the important attributes of a design. So for example, when we were watching the hand pollinator video, we saw how the teacher, through guided conversations, helped the students to identify what pollinators need to do. They need to pick up and they need to drop off pollen, which they modeled using baking soda. So generating these kinds of criteria for the technology can help spark in the students a discussion about materials and their properties. Students are actively building their understanding of materials and their related vocabulary in elementary school. To ensure that students have equitable access to engineering and to ground their experiences and their conversation in real experiences, we believe that elementary students should have the chance to systematically explore the properties of different materials that are available before they are asked to design and build with them. So in our materials, next slide, we encourage teachers to give students time to explore and learn more about these materials they will use. Each group receives a set of material samples and touches them and manipulates them to become familiar with them. Then the class works together to create a chart like this one, a materials and their properties chart. This allows the children to have a sensory motor experience, construct more specific understandings of how they might use the material, build more precise and expanded vocabularies as they describe what they've observed. Students can make predictions about which properties might matter in the construction of their designs and then systematically test the materials to see how they perform. As they compare the various materials and their properties, they can see how they function and build knowledge of the world around them. Then they can select the appropriate material for their design considerations. Instead of choosing a material because it's pink or metal, two of the favorite material properties of young students, regardless of the challenge, students can make decisions based on how the materials meet these larger design criteria. Before the students tackle an engineering design challenge and build their solutions, they need to be able to handle and manipulate the material. Luckily, students, particularly really little students, are very excited for the opportunity to use and touch all different kinds of materials as they learn about their properties and brainstorm potential design solutions. Of course, all this focus on materials in the classroom can present challenges for teachers, and that's where the second challenge comes in. To make your job easier, we recommend prepare. So you can free up time later on and reduce in-classroom headaches if you prepare and make sure all the necessary materials are prepped and ready to use. So for example, we encourage teachers, if they are going to need a 4-inch by 4-inch aluminum foil sheet, to cut these squares ahead of time. Count out the materials before the unit begins. Gather everything that is needed. Group the sets of materials together and then compile them into sets of boxes or bags or bins to get them onto the desks that the students are using. To help students focus, we have found that handing out small materials bags that contain one sample or a small 1-inch square can allow students to touch and explore materials while keeping the focus on the materials and not, for example, how long the aluminum foil is when it's completely uncoiled from its roll. So some of the design challenges that we use may also use some sort of base model that students are just designing a part of. So for example, students might be challenged to design only one part of a much more complicated system, just the blades for the windmill in the upper left corner, the maglev train for the track in the bottom part, or the insulation part of a solar oven. If you teach a unit that requires some sort of base model, we recommend that you try to build the model ahead of time. And then if you can and you have space, save that base model and use it from year to year. Even better, we recommend if you can recruit materials helpers, those are great. So colleagues, parents, students helpers, even corporate volunteers sometimes can all assist in compiling all these necessary components for the students' engineering challenges. All the prep work that you do ahead of time will help make managing and distributing those materials during class even better. During the lesson, your students really want to touch all the materials. Because they're new and fun, it's important to give students time to feel and explore them. So we have found in our lessons that structuring time for the students to consider these materials' properties and become familiar with them can help them then focus in later lessons on how they'll use them. Just make sure to communicate any important instructions before the students receive the materials to ensure that you have their full attention. Because once you hand out those materials, it's all hands to explore. Once the students begin to create their own unique design, then each group may use different materials in different amounts. That means you have to sort of think about how you consider the classroom layout and arrange the materials. Students will be standing up, moving around as they get the items that they want. So many of the teachers have told us that they like to recommend using a material station or a material store. And that's where the teacher, a classroom aide, or some adult helper sets up one location with all the materials that the students will be using, and then oversees material distribution from that spot. So the students will walk up after they have sketched an idea or a design, list what materials they want. Then one member will bring that materials list to the store manager, who doles out the specified items. And having such a material station can help students create a plan and then adhere to that plan as they build, which not only mirrors how engineering is done in the real world, but also helps students to prevent them from being distracted by all the fun options once they get up to the store, and instead start to focus on the purpose of their technology and what they'll need to design it. At the end of the challenge, we also like to recommend that teachers ask students to return any unused materials, deconstruct unwanted versions, salvage materials that can be reused, and help organize the materials for later use or use in different challenges.
So I'd like to add that, yes, there can be a lot of materials that are used for engineering units, although I wouldn't really say that it's any more than what teachers may use in many interactive science or social studies units. Many times these materials are also things that are easy to find in the classroom. The more that I have done engineering through working with Christine, the more I found wonderful uses for paper and note cards and a lot of those everyday classroom materials. So gathering and prepping those early and thoroughly is super, super important. It's a little bit of pre-work, but keeps the focus in the moment really on the thinking and the developing of the new ideas. I also recommend always having some extras, just in case some of the materials get damaged when kids are first exploring them, or also if something comes up that a student or two needs to change their grouping and therefore use different sorts of materials on their own. So I think back to several years ago when I was teaching second grade and was planning to teach a unit in which we were going to be lighting Egyptian tomb models that were created from those big copy paper boxes. And worrying that I wasn't going to have enough time to get everything together, I called in these two great parent volunteers that regularly volunteered in my classroom. And since the plans were nice and clear, they were able to create these tombs, as well as organize a lot of the investigative materials so that kids would be able to know what they were working with then when it came to their design challenge. And they were so interested, and their curiosity got picked as they were putting these things together. You can see from the slide here, not a typical use for a photocopy paper box. That then they actually volunteered, hey, we really want to come back and see this when you're working on it in the classroom. So I got a bonus that I had two people there then to help me out when I was working with the class in the moment of the lessons. So I also want to say how important I think it is for children to get that time to manipulate and talk about the materials that they're going to use before they get down to work. It's a bit like in a math lesson when children need a minute or two to play with any sort of counting or measuring manipulatives before they start focusing on their work. But here I think it's even more important because often the play helps to determine how they're going to use those materials in their design challenges. Since most of my work, well, pretty much all of it, has been with students who are learning a second language, I've taught a lot of many years in Spanish to native English and Spanish speakers, as well as English to native Spanish and speakers. So everybody's always, there are always some children that are learning a language, and being able to have that time to discuss the vocabulary that's necessary and to learn new vocabulary to understand the concepts, I think is extremely important for students. I think back many years ago about teaching children about how to design a membrane, which was something that many of my children hadn't thought about before they had this unit in school. And they hadn't thought much about membranes, didn't really know a lot of the vocabulary, native speakers and non-native speakers. And they had never really thought about building a sort of membrane, a mock membrane for this challenge. So the time that they were able to feel the textures and the properties of sponges, both wet and dry, was super important to help them to know how they were going to be able to incorporate those into their designs later on. So again, that idea to be able to talk, to converse with their peers about those properties, developing that vocabulary, the chart that you showed, Christine, about the vocabulary is, I think, super important, not only to get their input about some of the properties, but also to help guide them to understand what some of the words are so that they can communicate with them and with other people, I think is very important, so that they can work with their peers during the challenge process.
Great. Okay, challenge number 3. How am I going to manage my students' varied creative design? So in the real world, and thus in the classroom, engineering problems rarely have one and only one unique solution. So to model this aspect of engineering for students, we think that design challenges should be constructed intentionally so that they allow for many different kinds of solutions. So here, for example, are just some of the solutions from one class that designed a knee brace that will support an injured knee. So each design challenge needs to articulate criteria and constraints, and students need to be able to evaluate their own solutions in relation to how well they meet them. Students should be encouraged to take risks and experiment with those out-of-the-box ideas. But they should also have time to review their classmates' designs and think about how they are similar and different to their own. The opportunity to design something unique can make engineering highly interesting and engaging for students. Both students and teachers appreciate that multiple solutions are possible. In fact, many of our teachers tell us that it's one of the highlights of teaching engineering. Ms. Mock, that first grade teacher from Minnesota, whose students engineered hand pollinators, called out this multiplicity of student solutions as one of her favorite parts of the experience.
I think the variety of solutions that the kids came up with was the most exciting for me. None of the hand pollinators looked the same, not even similar. They used obviously the same materials. They're very creative, they're very different. It was, I think the most exciting part was to watch them try it and then to see the wheels turning and to talk amongst themselves about how to improve it was priceless.
So managing a classroom where students are tackling open-ended engineering challenges that allow multiple solutions may seem daunting. You may be wondering how you'll keep track of each group's unique design and provide meaningful feedback. Teachers tell us that students embrace the opportunity to create an original design. However, the teachers also tout the value of establishing some parameters. So for example, teachers have suggested the importance of limiting the materials that students might use, at least initially. So having students choose from specified materials instead of a wide array or whatever they bring to class focuses them and their work. It allows them to explore these materials in more depth to understand their properties and how they function. The common materials also then provide a base that allows students to share and discuss what they have learned with one another because there's something they have in common. Groups can learn from one another when they focus on a common challenge. So if all of the students in the class are tackling the same problem with similar materials, you, the teacher, can become familiar with the types of design student groups generate and the types of problems they might encounter. Working with the class to identify the criteria and constraints of their engineering problems can help you tailor your comments and feedback to what your students will need to achieve their goals. So for example, in a class working to design a process for cleaning up a model oil spill, students are told that one constraint they face is the materials that are available. They can choose from 9 different types of materials, each of which has a price. Next slide. As a class, you've discussed the goal to create the cheapest possible solution that also removes the maximum amount of oil from both the water and the shoreline. In their little tiny tin, they've got both water and then some gravel. Hopefully your experience leading the activity in previous years has taught you that students need to be reminded that each time they dip a material in the oil, they need to log its price, not just the first time. You also know that students will be surprised at first and then frustrated by how much it costs to clean up a spill and how much of the oil still remains on the water even after they think the process is complete. So they're going to need some encouragement and questions that help them focus on how to improve their process when they begin redesigning. As these students groups explore the design solutions, you can guide them through the process, modeling and asking what kinds of questions, or asking the kinds of questions that develop critical thinking and reflection. What's going to happen? I wonder, those kinds of questions, or on data-driven decisions and actions that should guide the work they're doing. Your questions will guide the students to think about their technology and design more deeply. In some cases, you may encourage students to focus on the design challenge's goal or focus their attention on an element of their design that you suspect will cause some problems, given what you know about the design. Over time, though, we know that teachers develop a trove of general engineering questions, as well as questions that are tailored to specific engineering design challenges that will focus student attention on relevant aspects of the problem. Next slide. Some of these engineering questions include, how does your design reflect what you've learned yesterday or from previous lessons? Why did you choose the materials that you chose? What did you notice when you tested your design? Did your design work as you expected? Why? Why not? How, if the design fails, because they tested it to failure, did the design fail? Which aspects of the design might be the problem? The questions related to how they can improve their design, how they might redesign it to better meet whatever goal they're pursuing, making it faster, cheaper, stronger, more able to clean oil. And then if they've done multiple designs, did the current design work better than the previous design? And why or why not is that the case? So next slide. In addition to walking around the classroom and providing feedback to individual groups, it's helpful to and important to structure time for whole class reflection and discussion so that students can learn from their peers' efforts as well. These kind of periodic whole class discussions allow student groups to share their current design. You can ask students to describe the similarities and differences across their various solutions, and then also encourage them to consider what general principles underlie the challenge. So for example, during a group discussion on how to design an effective parachute, students may begin to consider the relationship between the canopy size of the parachute and the suspension line length, especially when they're told they have a limited overall size for their parachute. If you ask students to share their data, their designs, and their ideas, they can spark new ideas not only for their own group, but for other students' designs. So posting these in the class data table can help the students and all students learn from each other's efforts, as you see here in this table. More importantly, the activity can prompt students to reflect upon the larger engineering and science principles that inform their design challenges. As students present their final designs in a showcase or test their solutions in front of the class, they should share information and explanations as they reflect on their work and celebrate their learning and success as a whole class. Nancy?
So to me, actually, the difference in all of these designs is kind of like the icing on the cake. This teaching. One of the greatest takeaways that I want my children to have is that there's not always one right answer to a problem, and that many times there's no definite end to solving a problem. If there were more time and more years, we'd keep doing new things. I often talk to them about how many versions of smartphones there are, as well as models of cars there are. Every year we can do something new. This is actually an uncomfortable concept to a lot of my students when they first start engineering, because sadly, many times in school, there is a correct answer to things. They're being asked for one right answer. And I will say that I have had students that that really resist starting because they're a little bit afraid of doing something wrong, and they need a bit of assistance getting comfortable with being able to work this way. So I think it's important as the teacher to watch out at the beginning for those students who might not know how to get started. And I find that hints are okay in this case, but if I give a hint, I like to give two, because I may say, okay, so what we learned before might make you think this, or maybe it can make you think this, so that I don't end up guiding them down a certain design path. And, you know, just going back to, I guess, 15 years ago, I remember one of the first units that we were looking to design had to do with putting together some simple machines into more compound structures to move a sack of potatoes. And I had in my mind, after having taught these units on simple machines to kids for several years, you know, just what would be the perfect design. And boy, was I wrong, because when the first kids started building these combinations that I had never thought of, I realized, wow, I really need to learn about my own divergent production a bit more. So it was a wonderful experience, and continues to be every time I get to work with new students in this way.
Nancy and Christine, I just want to bring your attention to the time. It's 4:44, and So we can continue, but if you want to skip ahead or abbreviate so we can get through these, that would be great.
Yep, we should be good. We're tracking on with the things, and we may want to pause just to make sure if there are questions. I want to make sure we don't run out of any time for those. So maybe we'll stop for a minute, see if there's anyone who has a question they'd like to share in the chat box.
Yeah,
we're happy to take those.
Yeah, Linda asked a question of Nancy having to do with the bilingual classes, and she said, do you help the parents of your English language learners learn some of the scientific and engineering terms to facilitate conversations at home?
Yeah, so as a classroom teacher, I was always sending weekly communication to the families of my students, and so that was definitely one way, but also through different meetings throughout the year, and something that I continue to do in the position that I'm in now is going through also in person with parents what the main are, and I'm trying to give a couple of quick examples, not necessarily from the units that I work on with the kids, but for example, the idea of, you know, that wonderful smartphone, things that adults can relate to every day. So even if they haven't really thought about this process per se, they see it, they see the design changes and the improvements in the products that they're working with. I try also to define a little bit based on some questions that go along with each of the steps of the design process to help people understand exactly what kinds of questions kids might be asking at each stage. So I hope that answers. If not, you know, tell me more and I'll tell you more.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
So carry on, Christine.
Yep. So next one, my students won't like it when their designs don't work. So we did hear from teachers, particularly in the earlier grades, that their students might feel discouraged or upset if their designs and when their designs fail. But this kind of behavior or reaction stems from belief that failure is an intrinsic or personal trait, and it's not. So part of what we're trying to help kids learn in engineering is that failure is an extrinsic trait that should be attributed only to particular designs or to a group's inability to work together, perhaps. We encourage teachers in engineering to recast the role of failure and emphasize that engineers fail often in order to succeed sooner. So as you lead classroom discussions and presentations, scaffold your students' understanding of such failure. Remind them that failure happens often during the engineering design process and that all engineers face failure. And when it does, and it will, reinforce the idea that the design has failed, not your students themselves. One of the things that teachers tell us is they try to communicate and model, but that there's a lot to learn from failure. So what didn't work this time? Why not? How can we improve the next design? These can all inform better designs the next time around. So the teachers that I'm going to show you two brief clips from teachers who teach in two very different types of settings. And they're talking about their experiences with failure in engineering and how it not only helps the kids more and more about engineering, but also prepares them for life in general.
My kids come from a large free and reduced lunch area. I think we're about 80%. And most of my kids struggle with giving up. When kids are working with EIE and they're working on problem solving and they're developing their persistence, the idea of not giving up so you improve it and that you keep going, it's really a valuable thing. So it really develops their that habit to not give up and to keep going and to go on and do things like go to college and graduate from high school and you know, things that a lot of kids in this school don't often think of.
And the second teacher works with a slightly different group of children, but they too also benefit from encountering failure in engineering.
I'm the gifted and talented specialist in our school district. And failure is not something that a lot of my students experience on a regular basis. they oftentimes experience great frustration actually, because it's not something that they get used to. And I try to emphasize to them all the time that when they're failing or struggling, they're literally, their brains are growing, and that's when growth happens, is when there's failure. And so, the fact that we went into this saying we're going to destroy these and they're all going to fail, I think on some level was liberating, especially for the kids who aren't used to dealing with that. And seeing that as that is your opportunity to improve. That failure is your chance to see how you can make it better.
So we find it's really helpful, especially in elementary school, to downplay competition between individual or group designs. We suggest that students focus more on working as a class to try to generate the best design solutions possible. In this dynamic, successes and failures are shared by everyone, which better enables students to celebrate original ideas, the effective parts of design, and overall high-performing design. It will take students time to adjust, accept, and even welcome failure. For example, as we heard, teachers report that their highest achieving students, many of whom have not encountered failure before, have the most difficulty facing failure. However, these teachers also mention how they appreciate the opportunity to have an open conversation about failure and encourage their high achieving students to reconsider their relationships to failure.
So you've seen some pictures and some videos about people working with children to design hand pollinators. And recently I worked with a group of third graders trying that challenge. And the bullying factor set in. So some of the kids wanted sparkly pollinators that looked a little bit more like magic wands than like hand pollinators. And so they used a lot of aluminum foil to create those designs that did not work so well. And so I made a point, and I always like to make that point, as Christine talked about, to take a couple of moments mid-lesson so that kids can look around and see what other people are doing, and seeing and listening to their peers about what's working and what's not. Sometimes kids do get a bit disappointed if a material doesn't work, but then I try to ask them to go back to those original tests that they've run so that they're really making their choices based on evidence, and that then they can rethink to try to make some better choices as they're trying to improve their designs. And I think it's also important to remember that even if children are unhappy or frustrated when a design doesn't work, that's okay. I think that dealing with frustrations are important for our children. We often teach kids in words that we need to learn from our mistakes, but putting that into practice is even more important. That ability to be able to deal with failure and frustration without giving up is probably the most important that they can learn from the engineering design process. I have seen kids take 30 minutes to put together their design blades for a windmill, only to see it not spin the windmill at all. And I see that that's frustrating. If I can help them through that process of getting over their frustration and trying again, and maybe trying again and trying again, then to me that's a more powerful life lesson than any kind of connection directly to whatever math or science I'm doing. Getting over that frustration and working with that frustration can really serve them well.
Great. Okay, challenge 5. I don't know how to grade my students on engineering. So our goal as educators is to nurture the ability to tackle such open-ended design challenges. And as we do, we want to strive to help develop students' engineering habits of mind. So the assessments that we use need to reflect these goals, and we need to communicate clearly and consistently about what we're expecting from students. So for each engineering challenge we create, we specify criteria and constraints to guide the students' work. So next slide. Assessing the product is only one part of an engineering project. What perhaps is much more important, particularly for the little guys, the elementary school students, is the process that they go through. So this slide shows 3 of the engineering design processes that we tend to use at the preschool, elementary school and middle school levels. But as the students go through these processes, next slide, we want them to be comfortable engaging in engineering practices. And this chart shows 16 of them that we have identified that we're trying to help students develop. So for example, they should become more comfortable asking questions, finding answers to them, brainstorming, considering their colleagues and friends' ideas, handling physical materials to create a prototype, gathering data, making decisions based on data, collaborating with teammates, communicating what they've learned. Those are just some of the kinds of things that we think it's important for them to be developing in classrooms. So as we teachers provide feedback to students, we have them keep in mind these practices and habits and make sure that the evaluative feedback is signaling that this kind of stuff is what's important. How they work to generate a design solution and what they do to improve the solution should be important and more important than any one particular design. So next slide. You may find that it's helpful to assess students' engineering efforts with a combination of a portfolio and an ongoing performance assessment. Our work with educators has shown us that scaffolding students' work with a semi-structured portfolio, a set of worksheets, or a student notebook can prompt students to document their ideas and reflect on their work and data while providing a log for the students and the teachers. Periodic poll/share-outs provide more formal opportunities for students to explain and present what they're working on. So if ongoing documentation of students' progress is required, you can use journals and rubrics to contribute to student learning. So Nancy?
So I think that when you read through and decide what activities you're wanting to do, how you're going to use these materials, I think it's important that each teacher thinks about what he or she wants to get out of these lessons, by asking what are your children going to come away with. So you may think, well, 5 examples of applying concepts from their science unit, showing flexibility of thinking, effectively communicating ideas in pictures, writing, and conversations. I think it's important to set those goals for yourself and for your students right from the beginning, so you know what you're looking for. I think that the rubrics that are in the unit are a great place to start. Here's a picture of one of those rubrics. I often find that I make a checklist of what I want though ahead of time, so that then I can go through and create something that's based on what I know for what I know that I need for my report cards. And if you look at like the next generation science standards for engineering, they're pretty simply stated. They're also, I think, a great place to start, which honestly, in many cases, just being able to follow the engineering design process to create a solution is what students are being asked to do. So using some of these pre-made rubrics, as well as thinking what it is that you're trying to get your students to show, is great before you go into the lesson.
And then the last challenge, which I know nobody expressed as one of their central ones today, is that there will be kids in the class who are left behind. So there's some very highly differentiated classrooms out there. But one of the things we've heard from teachers again and again is that engineering challenges, if they're thoughtfully designed, can provide a range of entry points for students. So they might tackle a simple problem with one constraint, or the same problem with a much larger number of specified constraints and criteria. So they might help a student through an interesting context, the relevance of a problem to their own lives, or a role model that they admire. Problem solving might entail almost no reading or documentation, or it could require careful data collection and analysis. The opportunity to move around the classroom, manipulate physical artifacts, and think in innovative ways can really draw a range of students into the task. So we found that English engineering activities can engage a very wide spectrum of students, such as English learners, students with special needs, students who do not best express themselves in writing, active students, artistic students, and many others. They invite students to show what they know by demonstrating, oftentimes with a physical model, their solution to a problem. So they're able to pursue creative ideas that they find interesting and learn from their failed attempts. So we encourage teachers to tailor their challenge so that they're age appropriate and accessible to all students in their classroom. But don't assume too much about what those students know and can do. We are constantly surprised by what they're capable of when we actually bring something to the classroom. As in all pedagogy, developing fluency in engineering instruction takes practice and reflection. So teachers tell us that they start to feel comfortable, and Nancy can speak to this as well, about the third time they lead an engineering activity. And they start to feel like experts somewhere around year or time 6. So we've worked really closely with teachers to try to develop resources that can support them as they begin to implement engineering or as they become more expert. Nancy?
So, yeah, I understand that sort of concern that it can be tricky to make sure that one student doesn't dominate the design and that somebody isn't left out. I often choose groups, not always though. Sometimes students are allowed to choose with whom they would like to work. But as an example, I recently was working on a group to create petroglyph replicas that had never tried any engineering kind of in a classroom setting before. And after a couple of sessions and testing, I let some kids who wanted to try things out that their group wasn't wanting to do things on their own. I also find that in general, I get a lot of feedback from students during these units, and students will say if they're not getting their ideas in. I kind of relate it to them that many times in our adult world, we don't stay in one company or in one school and work with all the same people and on the same projects forever. And so sometimes needing to work with different needs to switch around mid-challenge is an okay thing to do.
Great, so that wraps up our 6 general areas of challenge that we've seen with teachers. Of course, there's many more specifics, but I want to leave the last minute or so. If anyone has any questions, we're happy to stay for a few more minutes. I'm sure if folks have questions, we invite you to share them now.
You can also, we do have a forum set up on linkengineering.org if you find out you have some questions or you're you want to follow up or you have anything like that going on. So you can continue the conversation at Link Engineering if you don't have any questions at this time. I want to just since we are at 5 and I'm not seeing any questions jumping out, I think we're gonna say thank you to everybody for coming today, especially Christine and Nancy for this inspiring presentation. I certainly learned a lot. Clearly, there is far more to discuss about this than can fit easily in an hour, but this is a tremendous start, and I appreciate you both for being here. Our next video conversation will be in 3 weeks. We're still finalizing the details, so I can't give you exact details, but upcoming talks will be covering engineering in the next generation science standards and making good use of maker spaces. The series will continue throughout the summer, so stay tuned, and I hope you can join us again. In the meantime, be sure to stop by linkengineering.org where you can ask questions, find resources, and get basic engineering information. And a follow-up email, you'll all get a very nice follow-up email which will have links to the resources that were mentioned here, certainly to Engineering is Elementary and to Christine's book and to some of the other sources that were mentioned. So I want to thank you all for being here. It was tremendous. And I hope everybody has a great week.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. Bye, Christine.
Bye-bye.